All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome to part 4 of 4 of our Nerd Nite Stream You in September series. We've had 16, well, we've had 12 presentations already. We've got 4 more tonight, obviously mostly about space. And so really excited to have you all back for the final chapter here. For tonight, we got Nerd Nite Philadelphia representing, and Chris is going to be here to talk about, some more silly versions of space and characters from out of this world. Then we've got Nerd Nite Baltimore coming up with some folks that you may recognize. We'll get to in half an hour. We're going to talk about shadows in space. I'm not going to say your names because you can see them on the screen, and that would be redundant, and I don't want to bore anyone. We've actually, I don't know why I said that. Then we got Nerd Nite Calgary coming up at the next top of the hour. We're going to talk about a conceptual exploration of living in space. And then about an hour and a half from now, we've got Don coming to you from Monday morning in Tokyo. He's 13 hours ahead of us. He's time traveled. He's already had his Sunday night at 8 o'clock Eastern time. So Don, the time traveler, is going to talk about radio bursts coming to all of us. So hey, everyone, wave to the millions of people watching here. For all of you who are participating, just a couple of quick housekeeping things, super easy. Number one, obviously, you have this delightful chat area in the Facebook feed where you're watching. Go ahead and let us know where you're logged in from right now, and also, most importantly, what you are drinking. It is Nerd Night. In Don's case, it's a nerd morning. Hopefully, he's probably not drinking anything too alcoholic unless there's a Bloody Mary at the start of workday, but that's probably also a bad idea. Don't follow my advice, Don. That's terrible career advice. Everyone else who's on a Sunday night, cheers to all of you. Thanks for joining us. And I also want to let all of you know that this will be recorded, just like the past 3 Nerd Nite Stream You in Septembers have been recorded, and they will live right here on the Nerd Nite Facebook page. Facebook does a terrific job of posting recordings literally seconds after the live stream ends. So at like 10:01 Eastern, 8:01 Mountain Time, this should be live here, and that would be what 10:31 a.m. Tokyo, or I'm sorry, 11 a.m. Tokyo time. That'll be posted right here on the Facebook page. All right, so with that, everyone who's not named Chris Cummins, please mute your mic and disable your webcams for a moment here. And I want to turn this over to our first presenter in the evening. A lot of you have seen Chris all over the place. He is a co-boss of Nerd Nite Philly, and he writes for Den of Geek and a ton of other pop culture websites and whatnot. He is a man of the world. He knows everything there is about to know about the fake aliens in this case, and big green men that may be walking through your front door. So you're here to see me. Chris, go ahead and take it away. Your turn to dazzle the audience.
All right, thanks so much, Matt. It's a pleasure being back in front of a Nerd Nite audience. I am the boss of Nerd Nite Philly, and unfortunately, we haven't been able to do the event since March. And what I want to do tonight is tell you all about cosmic comics. I could easily do about 4 hours on comic books. I'm not going to. I'm going to do about 15 minutes, and I'm going to talk about my favorite of all sci-fi comics that have been published over the years. Obviously, sci-fi comics first began, well, when would you think? You'd probably think around the 1950s with the rise of the space age. You're not entirely wrong, but in fact, the first science fiction comic ever was Mr. Skygack from Mars. Say that 5 times fast. It was created by cartoonist A.D. Kondo for the Chicago Daybook newspaper, and it ran from 1907 to 1911. Basically, it was a humorous comic in which a Martian reported back to his Mars superiors about things on Earth that were happening at the time. So it was kind of satire, fun, but it was popular enough that it spawned the first ever documented cosplay, which was when a Mr. William Fell of Chicago dressed as Mr. Skygack as a 1908 costume contest, and he won first prize, and cosplay was born. And the world has never been the same since. Although Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon have been popular since the 1930s and were early space comics and comic strips, it wasn't really until the 1950s that space comics exploded into the stratosphere. Sorry. Okay. But a lot of the comics that came out in the 1950s, like Weird Science that you see here, were very full of violence and just lots of alien mayhem and things like that. So kids loved them. Parents and authority figures hated them. And a lot of these stories were basically analogies for Cold War fears at the time. So not only were they fun for kids to read, they had some real substance to them. But again, the authority figures thought, oh, these comics are going to turn kids into juvenile delinquents. Let's ban them. And eventually the Comics Code Authority came into existence because of these type of comics and others. When the sci-fi comics kind of exploded, that's when things began to get strange. And strange comics are really what I'm all about. I am not a Bob Hope fan. I loathe Bob Hope. He's from another era. If you love him, good on you. I mean, I'm super, but I just remember as a kid having to go to my grandmother's house and sit there and watch the Bob Hope specials where he's like, oh, here's Aunt Jillian. Here's what you're fighting for with the football teams and everything. And I'm just like, I don't know what you're talking about, Bob. Do you know what year it is, Bob? I don't think you do, Bob. And Bob Hope, he just bummed me out. Can't say the same for his comic books. Comic book Bob Hope. Oh, I love it. He's mixing up with Martian people and getting into scrapes with weird aliens. It's a wild comic. Every issue would have Bob in a different far out adventure, either on Earth or in outer space. But he was always more than just like a hacky comedian. Again, apologies to the Bob Hope fans out there. He's not for me. Jerry Lewis. Well, yeah, Jerry Lewis is Jerry Lewis. So he also had one of these comics because these comic companies knew, and these were DC comics, and both the Bob Hope and the Jerry Lewis title around 110 issues each. So yeah, they were very formulaic, but people, especially kids of the era, loved these. And DC knew that they could profit off of the sci-fi comic rush that was kind of exploding in the early 1950s. The best forgotten sci-fi comic character is Fat Man, the human flying saucer. He was created by C.C. Beck, who is a writer who created the original Captain Marvel, as well as Otto Binder in 1967. This comic ran for 3 fantastic issues before falling into the mists of time and then later the public domain, which is why you can get several reprints of these on Amazon pretty cheaply right now. But this book chronicled the adventures of Van Crawford, who was a very nice, kind of knowledgeable man about town, but he was morbidly obese, and he was able to transform himself, as one does, into a flying saucer. And you see on your screen here, that's what it looked like when he made himself into a flying saucer. Why not? But he fought villains like the Gnarly Gnome, Brain Man, Syntho the Patchwork Man, and Deadly Moon Witch. They were kind of his 4 supervillains that was riffing on the Fantastic Four, which had just come out at the time. Only these Fantastic Four were more of a fearsome 4, and they were all evil and wonderful and just great designed. This comic is so ready for a comeback. I don't know, but I believe it is still in the public domain, so hopefully someone can jump on it and give us more adventures of Fat Man in the 21st century. Here you see Fat Man villain Lunita, I believe. She is a space hippie. She is just going to possess him with the powers of her twangy guitar. Okay, then. Another great thing about sci-fi comics that I love is they really created a lot of the narrative about alien abductions, which came to really, really dominate society in the late 90s. A lot of the typical alien abduction stories first happened in, if you don't believe they happened in real life, and if you do, I'm sorry you had that experience. But a lot of these comics had that very similar narrative to what later abductees or experiencers would say happened to them. Coincidence or just life imitating art? I'll leave that for you to decide. Another just absolutely amazing sci-fi comic is The Adventures of Kool-Aid Man. Yes, Kool-Aid Man. Kool-Aid Man is one of many licensed characters who in the 1980s was launched into outer space just for the hell of it. I mean, you have Kool-Aid Man, you have to do something with them. You have kids who are thirsty for more like Star Wars-y type adventures. So the first issue of Kool-Aid Man comes out in, I believe, the summer of 1983. It featured 2 stories. One where he was involved, helping out a kid's baseball team, and the other where he was fighting his villains, you see on the front cover there, they are the yellow thirsties in outer space. Of course, Kool-Aid wins. Everybody enjoys sugary drinks at the end of it. These, diabetes isn't mentioned anywhere in there, fortunately. And, it's really strange to think that Kool-Aid Man had 7 different comic books. At first, he was printed by Marvel, and then he went over to Archie. And yes, Archie did interact with Kool-Aid Man, but that's another talk for another time. My favorite comic panel ever is this on screen: Kool-Aid Man flying into outer space. I have this tattooed on my chest. I got that done about 5 years ago, and it looks fantastic. I will not show you all right now because I'm lying. But if I were to get a tattoo, it would be that, and it would be on my chest, because that is the most majestic image you are likely to see anytime soon. Other licensed comics are, based on either films that are enduring or films that are kind of here and then gone, or just kind of obscure sci-fi properties. Disney's The Black Hole is a movie that's really, since it's been on Disney Plus, gotten the attention it deserves. It's a really weird movie if you haven't seen it. It's kind of like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea goes to hell. It's very, very strange. It has a really disturbing ending. And the ending doesn't really leave much space for what happens next. But that didn't stop Whitman Comics from releasing a comic book that shows the ship of Black Hole, the Palomino, going back in time after it went through the black hole, and finding a society of dinosaurs and early man. And it's unclear if this is another planet, if this is just back in time on Earth, or what's going on. This is a very rare comic to get. Very fun comic, not to be confused with the Jack Kirby Black Hole newspaper comic, and we'll get more into Jack Kirby in a minute. So if you ever get a chance to read some of the Black Hole comics, check them out. There's an adaptation of the film, and then they go into these kind of other stories before the comic got canceled, at least. Next up is The Man from Atlantis. If you don't remember The Man from Atlantis, The Man from Atlantis was a very short-lived NBC series that NBC was touting as like the big thing of 1977. It starred Patrick Duffy, and he was a man from Atlantis, the lost continent, and he was here in present-day Earth, present day being the late 70s, and, he was able to help people using his kind of Aquaman-esque powers. The pilot film infamously features a racing sequence where he goes up against a dolphin to see who can swim quicker to get a fish. And Patrick Duffy got the fish, and then he went on to Dallas. So that worked out. Mars Attacks, of course, famously debuted as a Topps trading card line. In 1996, it was made into the Tim Burton movie of the same name, which is a wonderful, delightful little movie. And in 2013, IDW, who is a fantastic licensor of all sorts of properties, did a company-wide strategy where Mars Attacks met all of their other characters. So there you had Mars Attacks meeting Ghostbusters, Mars Attacks meeting Transformers, and my favorite, Mars Attacks meeting Popeye. Now, I'm a sucker for Popeye comics. The E.C. Seeger and Bud Sagendorf Popeye comics are as masterful as anything as you're ever going to read. And this, by placing the Mars Attacks Martians into the Popeye universe and then having them get the stuffing beat out of them by Popeye, is something that every self-respecting comic fan should read at least one point or another. You always hear about the 1001 comics you need to read before you die. That's like at least a good 97 of them. It is chef's kiss good. Star Trek, of course, as you may imagine, is been represented for comics pretty much since the show came on the air. There have been so many great Star Trek comics over the years, and then there have been some ones that are terrible. It's the terrible ones that interest me more, because by being terrible, they kind of roll up and turtle into themselves to become to become something incredible, which is what happened in the case of the Marvel comics based on Star Trek that were published after Star Trek the Motion Picture. So these are like 1979 to early 81, and they only ran for 18 issues. And it's you can kind of tell why, because if you look on your screen here, you see Spock and Kirk and a planet of gnomes. The Enterprise crew in a haunted house. The Enterprise crew fighting a space Loch Ness monster. And of course, the Enterprise crew fighting Satan. So if you thought like Spock's brain, that episode was beyond the pale, you really, really owe it to yourself to kind of get your hands on these comics. These have all been reprinted over the years. You can get them cheaply in a trade paperback, and it's kind of this weird, forgotten aspect of Trek fandom. There are Star Trek comics to this day that are fantastic that you can just pick up in comic stores everywhere. They're great for what they are, but I like weird comics, so these Star Trek, it's kind of both the worst and the best for me. Now, when you talk about anything related to comic books, it's best to mention Jack Kirby, the famed Marvel creator who gave the Fantastic Four their look. He's just a comics journeyman whose influence reigns to this day. He saw 2001 and just was in love with it. Marvel was getting the license to do comics based on 2001, which is, an odd thing to do in and of itself. Not odd just because it's like, how do you translate this world into comic books? But Kirby did it. Kirby did it for 10 issues, and he kind of just expanded mainly on themes and, the nature of man, where we're going as people, where we've been. And, he created books here, stories here that are just mind-blowing, next-level stuff. It's the sort of thing that should be studied in college. These comics are so deep and so meaningful. But Kirby was, this brilliant, kind of intellectual artist and writer who also, he wanted to adapt The Prisoner for Marvel Comics, and that's a heady thing to try to incorporate into comics. There were two different kind of pilot issues of The Prisoner done. None ever went to print and became a series, which is really a shame, because I would have loved to have seen what could have happened with an ongoing Prisoner series. But it's worth mentioning that in issues 84 to 87 of the Fantastic Four, they do a storyline where the Fantastic Four goes to this Latvian village that Dr. Doom is operating, and it's all very Prisoner-esque. The area is very much like the village of the Prisoner TV show. So although Kirby didn't get to do the actual Prisoner comic, he did get to leave that show's influence on the Marvel Universe, which is a great thing. And any of you who don't know who Jack Kirby is, and I doubt there are many of you watching this who don't, do yourself a favor and research it. And there are wonders await you. Wonders also await you when you get into the Star Wars comics. Now, the first comic book of Star Wars that came out was the 6-issue adaptation that Marvel Comics put out in 1977. There were not very many Star Wars products at launch. People forget this because there's so much of it now. But when the movie was in theaters, there initially was not very much merchandise. One rare example to this is the Star Wars comic, which after the first 6 issues that adapted the movie, let the story expand and explode, and gave readers who were just dying for anything in a galaxy far, far away great new stories and characters to meet, and the opportunity to learn about, our heroes. Sometimes our heroes met up with green rabbits who were mercenaries, who were named Jackson, who are, pardon my language, the fucking best. Jackson the Rabbit is the most notorious of all Star Wars supporting characters. He is he's what the kids call a badass. And he is a lovable character who, if you ask a Star Wars fan who reads the comics, they have very strong opinions on Jackson. He has been called the Jar Jar of the comics. And I feel like, let's give Jar Jar a break. Let's give Jackson a break. Star Wars should be fun. If you're toxic about Star Wars doesn't need you, But Jackson has endured over the years. They've recently brought him back into canon, back into recent Star Wars comics. So it's good to know that Jackson's still out there fighting the good fight. The best Star Wars comic of all is the story Into the Great Unknown, which established that Han and Chewie, due to a hyperdrive accident, get stranded on Earth, and Han Solo dies. His bones are recovered by none other than Han Solo, and it turns out that Chewbacca is actually Bigfoot, and the shirt kind of shows that off. Native Americans heard Chewbacca's crying for his falling friend, and they based the legend of Bigfoot upon him, and that's what is established in this Star Wars Tales issue, which read it if you get a chance. Here's some scenes from a bootleg Chinese Star Wars comic, which you can find online. Very much worth your time reading. I just quickly want to wrap things up here by talking about, anyone who knows me knows that I'm an Archie Comics guy, and Archie Comics has had more of their fair share of space comics over the years. Before he became known for his work with Archie Comics, Dan DeCarlo created a character named Jetta, who you see here with her boyfriend Archie, not Archie, Archie. And it was very kind of Jetson-esque humor, very like, it's Archie in space is basically what it is. And, due to this and his other great products like the Willie Lumpkin comic strip he did with Stan Lee, he wound up getting a job with Archie, and the rest is history. In the 1950s, Archies themselves put out Cosmo the Merry Martian, which was a comic adventure, comedic adventure, which ran for 6 issues. What was interesting about this is, like movie serials, every Cosmo issue ended on a cliffhanger. And Cosmo exists to this day. They brought him back in 2018 as part of their new Archie line. So if you're looking for like a fun kids-based comic, takes place in outer space, give Cosmo the Merry Martian a read. Bob Bowling and Derek Taylor, they infused their little Archie stories with all kinds of outer space weirdness, from multiple UFO abduction stories to evil space doppelgangers to robots run amok, as one does. Archie covers would as often as they could get in on the outer space game, from Close Encounters type movie poster to Archie meeting an alien. Then, of course, there are the tie-ins. There have been, as of this speech, 2 Archie versus Predator miniseries, both of which are very interesting. The first one's a little bit too mean-spirited for my taste, but the second one is very meta and excellent. And there's also the forthcoming Archie meets Flash Gordon. Looking forward to that. Here you see some Archie kind of outer space type screens. You see how the influence of Star Wars was impacted the Archie universe. And there was famously an issue where Archie and his friends took place in a Star Wars lookalike contest. So, yeah. Archie also in 1991 put out 2 great science fiction comics. Archie 3000, which answered the question, what if it were the year 3000 and people still had mullets? As well as Jughead's Time Police, a time-traveling adventure in which Jughead was teamed with Archie's distant future descendant. That's the word I'm looking for. And last year, Sina Grace, who you may know, has great work on Iceman, and Derek Charm did another mini-series of Jughead's Time Police, which was kind of like Crisis on Infinite Archies, because it had all the Jugheads from the various universes, including the TV show Riverdale, and the Jughead the Hunger horror comic meet up and save the fate of the universe so Jughead could win a pie-eating contest, because it's that kind of thing. Josie and the Pussycats in Outer Space, of course, was a famous cartoon based on the Archie comics. There is a toy you see there of Bleep that I just found out existed today, and I want to share that with you because who wouldn't want a toy of Bleep? But Alex DeCampi, who wrote Archie, versus Predator also just put out a Josie and the Pussycats in Outer Space comic, which is a Comixology exclusive that you can read there. And that's a lot of fun. It kind of riffs on what if Archie meets Alien, Archie characters meet Alien, which hasn't happened yet, but I imagine will any day now. And finally, Archie and E.T., two great tastes that just taste so great together. In the 1982, Archie's always on top of the trends, and they had Archie meet E.T. Turns out E.T. was just on Earth looking for soda pop. I don't know either. And The Life with Archie was an anthology that gave people fun stories of Archie in outer space every now and then. So that's about going to wrap it up for me. For more information, you can find me on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, your social media of choice at Sci-Fi Explosion. You can subscribe to my Patreon and my YouTube channel, follow my Spotify playlist, and every Friday night I do a free show on Twitch, twitch.tv/Sci-Fi Explosion at 7:30 p.m. Eastern. Thanks, everybody.
All right, so Chris, most importantly, since you mentioned Marvel and Kool-Aid Man together, the questions everyone in the audience wants to know is how would Kool-Aid Man do if he got to mix it up with Thanos?
Well, I always have felt that Kool-Aid Man would absolutely destroy Thanos in a second. He would give Thanos diabetes, clearly, and with his sugary power. But I think if Kool-Aid Man got the Infinity Gauntlet, and I feel like we all would, he would enslave humanity. He wouldn't wipe out humanity, but he would just force humanity to drown themselves in Kool-Aid. And that is not an oh yeah moment for me, Matt.
I don't know. That sounds like a delicious way to go. I've heard of many, many worse ways. The Kool-Aid Man, Kool-Aid Man really seemed to really strike a nerve with the crowd. A couple more questions. Want to know, has Kool-Aid Man appeared in any recent comics, space related or not?
No, sadly, the most recent. I wish I could remember the name. The last time I saw Kool-Aid Man, it was in an indie comic where I think it was like Kool-Aid Man Gets Fired. In which Kool-Aid Man has an existential crisis after a rough day, and that's the most recent one. But Kool-Aid Man, with these licensed characters, Kool-Aid Man could always reappear. Archie had the license to do Kool-Aid Man comics in the late '80s, and he has not been in comics since.
What else is Kool-Aid Man qualified to do? Could he just be a wrecking ball? Could he just hang at the end? I don't know.
Oh, yeah. Kool-Aid Man could definitely be a wrecking ball. Kool-Aid Man could be... I've pictured Kool-Aid Man would, he would run a antique shop, but he would run it very poorly because he just knocked things over all the time. But his heart would be really into it. So I could see like a Kool-Aid antique shop which just sells Kool-Aid merchandise. I could get into that. I think he'd be qualified to do that.
I'd watch that sitcom.
Absolutely.
So you've shown 70, 80 comic book covers. Is there a top 3 or 4 of these that you showed specifically in this presentation that you would recommend to our viewers?
Yes, absolutely. Number 1 would be the Jughead's Time Police series, which came out last year by Sina Grace, because it is hilariously funny. You don't have to know anything about the Archie universe to get into it. So that's great. Number 2 would absolutely be Kool-Aid Man, because just Kool-Aid Man flying through space making sugar puns is incredible. There's also Kool-Aid Man in another issue meets Ben Franklin. So yeah. And then any of the Fat Man comics, because you read them and you feel like you have a concussion, like in a good way.
Great. All right, everyone. So I want to remind all of you, obviously you're looking on the screen there at where you can find all of his work. Also, there's actually one spot that he did not list on there where you can find even more, which is youtube.com/nerdnite. It's the official Nerd Nite YouTube channel to which you can subscribe right now. Just don't leave here. And he actually has a number of his past live presentations on there from when he guest appeared at Nerd Nite New York. One of them is about E.T., another one's about the marketing of Dune. I think those are the 2 that are there now. So even more to check out. All right, so Chris, great job. Please
Thanks so
stop
much, man.
sharing your screen, and we're going to turn this over to our good pals about 80 miles down I-95 from Philadelphia, to our friends at Nerd Nite Baltimore. I think what we're going to do first, I think we're going to have Roy give a little bit of a breakdown of all the things that are happening there and been happening, talk a little bit about Nerd Nite Baltimore in a couple minutes, and then we're going to pass it over to co-boss Dr. Joel Green, who many of you have seen at other past Nerd Nite presentations, talking about various telescope things. So that's it. Roy, take it away.
Okay, let me click all the right things here. I'm assuming I've done the clicking correctly. Thank you, Matt. So as Matt said, the flavor of the next half hour is space from Baltimore. Nerd Nite Baltimore, founded in 2016, and with over 20 events under our belts, is led by 5 wonderful co-bosses, Jen Sam, Patrice Woodard, Roy Prouty, note here, that's me, Joel Green, second note here, that's Joel, your speaker, and Jay Ferrone in absentia. She's no longer in Baltimore, but she's forever in our hearts. She's in Arizona, she's not like dead or anything. A shout out to everyone put this together. I guess Matt and everyone else who's talking. So thank you for putting all this together in these interesting times. But another shout out to our steadfast post-COVID host, Declina Doible, located in the Hamden neighborhood of Baltimore. And a third and final shout out to all of you. Thank you for coming out or logging on and sharing in all the nerdiness. As for tonight, well, it's actually not Pluto, but it's in the same universe. We're actually going to be talking about shadows in space, and Dr. Joel Green, one of our co-bosses, will be leading the talk. Before I get to Joel and all of his wonderful Joelness, if you're ever interested in presenting on behalf of or for Nerd Nite Baltimore, here's our contact information. But back to Joel. Joel Green, or Dr. Joel Green, is an instrument scientist at the Space Telescope Science Institute, sort of up the road from where I am right now in Baltimore, Maryland. He works with or on the Hubble Space Telescope. He studies the birth and occasionally violent deaths of planets and star systems, and in the hopes of uncovering our own solar system's history. Previously, Joel was the project scientist in the Office of Public Outreach at Space Telescope, where he helped bring the science of the Hubble, the James Webb, and Roman telescopes to the general public. He's appeared on National Geographic and PBS NOVA programs related to Hubble and the James Webb. And prior to joining Space Telescope in 2015, he was a research scientist at the University of Texas at Austin. Joel describes himself as a New Yorker who spent 12 years in upstate New York, 6 in Austin, and is now a resident of scenic Baltimore and co-boss of Nerd Nite Baltimore. Joel has acquired a fondness for crab and barbecue, cowboy boots and hats, sunshine, and Civil War battlefields. Without further ado, I will yield my screen sharing to you, Joel. Take it away.
All right, thank you. Thanks for that. Let's see, so I'm gonna now try to do the same thing you just did. Hopefully that works. Are we good? All right. Great, okay, thanks. Thank you for that introduction. It's nice to still be in scenic Baltimore. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a topic that's been really fun for me in the past 12 months or so. And that's a study I've been doing that involves the largest shadows that I've ever worked on, and some pretty impressively sized shadows. So you have to imagine the echo here, but the title of my talk is Shadows in Space. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Well, let's totally back out here. What makes a huge shadow in space? Well, I'm going to tell you a story that seems related, but that may seem unrelated, but hopefully you will see the connection momentarily. So we live in the solar system. It's our happy home collection of planets, of dwarf planets, of moons, of comets and asteroids, and dust belts of asteroid belts, and lots of little smaller dust grains and different particles, and little parcels of gas sometimes. Oh, and this giant star called the sun in the middle. And it's all kind of, mostly, for the most part, organized in this sort of planar aspect, this orbiting, disk, essentially, of planets. But why is it that way? Well, one of the things that we notice when we look at the birth of stars and birth of planets in other around other stars as they're being formed today in our galaxy is that they look a little bit different. And we can tell you that our solar system 4.6 billion years ago when it was forming looked a lot more like this, which is to say a big swirling disk made mostly of gas with small amounts of dust hanging suspended in that gas, collecting and coagulating, being destroyed, being reformed, crystallizing, and eventually these pebbles gathering together to make first the gas giant planets most likely, and then the rocky planets afterward, and the icy planets in between. So the materials that we see in the solar system and the materials that we know other planets are being made out of are things that we might commonly find on Earth. This is a sampling of things that have all been detected by telescopes in space around other stars, but we know that these are the kinds of things that, or here in comets and asteroids. And these are things that are constituents that build up into the planets that we're familiar with here. And here's an example just to show you I'm not talking about nonsense. If you cut open one of the meteorites that's landed on Earth, you see this beautiful collection of pebbles, and it kind of gives you just a sense as to how it might be that things aggregate from the tiniest to the largest scales. And one of the best ways to detect this dust, just to throw a little plug in there, is using the infrared telescopes like the James Webb Space Telescope, which we are the Mission and Science Operations Center for here in Baltimore. And we are launching that telescope late next year. So pretty excited about that. One of the biggest triumphs, I think, in recent years has been understanding the formation of star and planetary systems. So this is a beautiful cartoon, sort of drawing, artist's rendition of what a forming planetary system might look like. So this is just an artist's conception in 2009. And then 6 years later, this is an actual picture taken by the Atacama Large Millimeter Array in Chile. So this is a microwave image of a disk around a young star. And this is real. So these gaps here may or may not be completely empty, but they certainly suggest that this star system is in the process of doing something very interesting, whether it be chemistry or building new planets directly or whatever is happening there. But one of the things that's a little bit frustrating about an image like this, which is one of the best ones you can get of a disk, is that the habitable zone, so let's say the zone in the center of this star system where the temperature would be amenable to, say, Earth conditions or things like that, is 1 pixel in the middle. So there's really not a lot of detail that we can get on this. So one of the interesting things you could do is you can use the good old standby, the Hubble telescope. And Hubble has a very interesting property. So it looks in visible light, like we see with our eyes. And that will come up shortly as we talk about shadows. So this is a Hubble telescope image of a disk. This is a system that is young, like the ones I showed, and this is a real picture taken by the Hubble telescope, and the different colors or different gases and things like that. But that's not really important. The key is the different pieces of this. These two sort of arc-like shapes are the scattered light scattering off of one of these disks. The green stuff shooting out is this ridiculous jet of collimated material that's being flung out at enormous speeds in both directions. But what's really interesting is what you don't see. And that's this dark band in the middle. That is where the disk is, the shadow, the disk that everything's bouncing off of. And that's a problem. If you want to see a disk with visible light with the Hubble, it's going to be dark. And usually that's a big disadvantage. It means that we're not seeing through it. Light is scattered. If you turn your headlights on in a fog, the light might bounce back at you. It'll fail to penetrate the fog very well. And that effect is what we're seeing right here. So one option is to go to the infrared. But again, as I pointed out, we don't really have very good resolution. It's very hard to see the innermost regions of these things with more than 1 pixel at a time. So we want to get a much sharper picture. But there's a neat trick that we can use to take advantage of this. And it involves shadows. So take this beautiful picture right here. This is a piece of the Serpens molecular cloud. This is a big cloud of gas and dust that's making hundreds or thousands of stars at the same time now, as we speak, in our galaxy. It's about 400 parsecs, or about 1,300 light years away. So it takes light about 1,300 years to get to us from there. But all the light you're seeing in this picture is mostly simultaneous. But there's one very interesting feature. Now, your eyes might be drawn almost immediately to the sort of bottom right center, where there's a very, very bright star and this beautiful eye cavity. There's this big carved hole around it where there's nothing and it's dark. But there is another dark spot in this picture, and it is totally different than a cavity or hole. There's not, and I'll show you where it is in a second. So if you look at this region right here, and we zoom in on this feature, okay, now there's a few stars in the picture. Let's tip it so that it's symmetric. So we're kind of looking at it, these two cones expanding outward, right and left. All right, now let's blot the two stars that are kind of confusing the picture a little bit out. And we see that this is a very symmetric cone, kind of traced along by roughly these lines. And we notice that this whole feature actually looks kind of familiar. In fact, my first thought, and probably a lot of yours, was that it kind of looks like there's a gigantic bat signal in the Serpens Nebula. And there is one way that that's in common, which is the bat signal, to refer back to the comic talk from earlier, only works if you have a cloud to bounce the lack of light off of right behind it. And there is a big dirty cloud behind it, the Serpens cloud. So in that way, it's similar. But in other ways, there is not a 100 million mile tall Batman. It's actually more like this. So if you take a normal lamp in your house and you kind of look at how the light patterns work, if you look at this picture, you notice that the lamp shade is blocking the light bulb in the middle. And that means that there are areas of light and areas of dark. Now, it's not like there isn't stuff in all those directions, but the only parts that are illuminated are the bright parts that we're seeing. And there's these dark bands that look a lot like the thing I just showed you to the left and right of the light. So we're seeing something like that here. So this object called EC82, this young star in the middle, or HBC 672, is the light bulb in this analogy. You can sort of see the star, but you see these two dark bands and you see this light in all the other directions. So it's telling you that something is acting like a lampshade that's very specifically directional and oriented along the angle of the two shadows. So something is cinching off the light in those two directions very sharply, because there is gas there, it just can't see it because it's not illuminated. So and by the way, one of my favorite things about this picture is in the upper left, there's actually another one, like a miniature version of Shadow, we call it Shadow Junior, of another object, and that I'm not going to talk about at all, other than to say that it's like a weird little mini-me for the main object. They're unrelated, it's just a total coincidence. But here's the thing we can do. The disk, as I said, is probably less than 1 pixel in that image, much less than 1 pixel. But notice how big the shadow is. That's because the shadow is, in this case, thousands of times bigger than the original object, which is kind of amazing. So the shadow can give you details that you couldn't get about the original object. If you look at this picture of these two tourists, you can see their shadows are several times larger than them. And you're actually more crisply able to see the details of the guy's shape of his hat or the camera or the purse. And it just depends on, so you have these certain details that are that are essentially zoomed in, or in a way that's not possible in any other fashion. So although we can't tell certain details, others become clearer because it's a zoomed in shadow. Now, here's the really crazy thing about this. These are, I'm blinking now between two pictures that were taken by the Hubble telescope of this, all these pictures are from Hubble, of the same region, but taken roughly 1 year later, 1 year before, 1 year later, clicking back and forth. And yes, the stars all twist because the telescope optics have rotated by different angles. You have to ignore the fact that the stars are flipping back and forth. But notice how everything else, the cloud in the image and everything, is not moving, except you can very clearly see the two shadows clicking up and down together in the same orientation. And you can actually see the little bit of cloud that's shadowed, not shadowed, shadowed, not shadowed. And it's very organized. So in 1 year, it moved that much. So it's really interesting. So now, okay, no, it's still not a bat signal, but it is interesting. It is flapping like a bat. So what's happening? Well, let's go back to the analogy of that light bulb. So what would happen, of the lampshade, I should say, what would happen if the light were moved up and down? If the light bulb was itself bouncing up and down, you would get that effect. If instead the lampshade itself was warping or rippling, you would get that effect. Well, in this case, the lampshade is the disk, the planet-forming disk, most likely, around that really young star. So let me show you what I mean. So one option here is that So how would the light bulb move up and down? Well, it wouldn't do it by itself. That would be very strange. But if the star is in fact two stars, and one of those stars is much bigger than the other, and we couldn't tell you yet, we can't resolve it in enough detail to say, and those two stars were orbiting each other up and down, they would over time move in their sort of co-orbits, and the shadow would then move back and forth like this, expand, shrink, or move up, move down, depending upon the geometry, in the same region. The other option is that the disk itself has a warp, and that warp, this like fold, this gas, that it has some height to it, this dust. And as that moves around, the shadow in effect moves as different parts of the cloud become illuminated or not illuminated. Essentially, it's like your lampshade has a little wave in it. Now, if you look at this, so that's already awesome. So we have this greatly magnified image of a shadow. Okay. Now here's the other interesting fact. The shadow is so large that it takes light, at the speed of light, 45 days to get from the central star to the edge of the cone. So it takes light 45 days to cross the shadow, which means that light itself has a delay as it crosses the shadow. So how does the whole shadow move? So if you look at this picture of a garden hose, you can tell because you know intuitively that this hose must be spinning. And in fact, if you know how fast the water is coming out, you can figure out how fast the hose is spinning because of the motion, the arc of the water, the change in position. The idea that if I took a hose and I waved it back and forth, I would create kind of this stream. And this works because the water speed is sort of comparable to the speed at which the sprinkler is spinning. So the water waves back and forth in real time. And you're seeing in some sense a history or a recording of how the sprinkler was working. So we're seeing something like this here, and I can show you what I mean. If you look at the edge of the shadow, which initially you probably thought looked very straight, but it actually has little ripples in it that suggest that perhaps the disk is moving in real time. We're doing something very interesting. We can actually make a little mathematical model and figure out exactly what that would mean, okay? And see how quickly things would be changing. But what we are getting is this unique chance to study the change in height of that disk, magnified over the something 10,000 times larger than the actual disk. So since it takes like 45 days to travel the length of the shadow, what we're seeing as you look along the edge of the shadow is a 45-day history of the disk height or the star height, whatever it is, the ripple and that effect. So it's like you've been waving that garden hose back for 45 days and the water is still in the air and you can see exactly what you traced out. Or if you think about it, when a jet passes overhead and it makes a turn, you see the trail, you know where the jet was before, you know where the exhaust from the exhaust. So in some sense, it's a tracer of the past history of that system. So I think this thing is amazing. And so it has nothing apparently to do with Batman. I, don't want to overstate that. He has his ways, but the idea of using the very speed of light as a time travel tracer here to understand what's going on in this like microscopic area inside of the star and disk system is just amazing to me. So there's some math, which I'm not going to talk about, but just to impress everybody, here you go. That's our model. So what I want you guys to think about is, how can we, one of the things we'd like to do is figure out exactly what's going on here and what this can tell us about the little ripples in a disk and why should we be so obsessed with giant shadows in space? Let's see, so how am I doing on time? Good. So I think with that, I will turn the screen back to whoever, Roy or Matt, and take some questions.
All right, I will hop in until Roy is ready to go. So I have a question that I've wanted to ask you forever, but I feel like it's so novice that I've been embarrassed to, but it's Nerd Nite, so I'm going for it. So, all right, so take, for example, the lampshade shadow area that you just showed us. The sky is big. There are lots of astronomers in the world. How does an astronomer call dibs on what area of the sky they're going to study versus somebody else, and how much cooperation is there. That's my real weird, basic, sad question.
That is really not a basic question, actually. That understanding how astronomy gets done is probably one of the most, complicated and interesting facets. I mean, it's a tale of how science is done, right? So the way that astronomers think of the sky, of the universe in the sky, and this is going to sound a little bit arrogant, is that the entire universe is an experiment being done for our perusal. Basically, that everything that happens is like a lab test that, we didn't set up, but we can just kind of catch it. So let's say that I want to learn more about planetary systems. I might do some research into which systems seem like the best to study. But what we have to do is write these, it basically depends on what I want to do. So if I want to, I could go out to my backyard and I could look at that planet, but I couldn't take a picture nearly as good as Hubble. And Hubble is in a lot of demand, okay? So a lot of demand. And anyone in the world can write a proposal for time on the Hubble telescope, which means that they would get the joy of writing a 10-page justification for their science, explaining how they would precisely use the Hubble telescope to accomplish that science, and then have a committee of a few dozen or up to 50 to 100 professional astronomers vet it, criticize it, tear it to shreds, send you back comments, and hopefully accept a few of the proposals to go through, so that the Hubble people, which is also where I work, can use the best science that's been proposed and kind of create the most efficient schedule with which they can use the Hubble telescope. So the idea is that you want, let's say that, we make a call and we want a full year with some backups worth of cool science ideas for the Hubble. And they've been rated not by us, because we just take the input from the experts, which is the scientific community. And so it's sort of like the top of that survivor competition gets time on the telescope. So that's the other extreme, right? The opposite being, I could take my telescope out and look at it in New York. So it all kind of depends what you want to do. But this particular one is actually part of a series that is also has a slight, a fun, like, educational component to it, it was a prominent example of a shadow in space. And if you, I should have put a link up to it, but you can look around. There's this great little video on different kinds of shadows in space. And in fact, an example of that would be some civilizations have actually, we think of constellations, which are just, collections of stars that resemble things that we like. Some ancient civilizations have thought of shadow spots because they had dark areas in space. They use that in their constellation defining. So that's an example of how shadows played a very prominent role. But anyway, this was part of that, as well as part of a science experiment to study the Serpens cloud. So that's why there are two pictures, one from the first study and one from the second. So we didn't know, for example, no one knew that the bat shadow was going to flap, right? That was a total surprise.
Great. All right. Sorry to steal your thunder, Roy. It's all you.
Oh, no, this is a good question. I was happy to hear the answer. I see a question in the chat, and it is basically, you talked about the Hubble in answering Matt's question. Will the James Webb be treated in the same way?
Yeah. Short answer, yes, almost exactly the same way. So the difference there being that James Webb hasn't launched yet. So as we speak, the call is out. So if you have a good idea, the world is out writing proposals for the time on the James Webb Space Telescope, and we anticipate. So even among the 1,500 to 2,000 complete proposals that get submitted, usually about 10% of them get selected for Hubble, and we think something like that will happen for James Webb as well. So
and then sorry.
And other telescopes in space use that same procedure. So, for example, the Chandra X-ray Observatory is the same thing, or the Sophia telescope.
Gotcha. And then, sort of as a follow-up to that question, and specific to the James Webb, when it launches, which I think is supposed to be next October, 2021, how long after a successful launch will we start getting pictures back or start getting data back?
Yeah, we're all really excited. So, the launch takes place. Just to give a little background. So a year from October 31st, roughly, is the current launch date and planned launch date for the James Webb, and it's going to launch on a rocket from Kourou, French Guiana. So it's going to go up, and about a half an hour after that, the control will move to Baltimore, actually. So we'll be controlling the systems from here. and I will not personally be controlling the systems from here, but it will be doing that. And it'll be going up. And so then it takes about 30 days for the telescope to set up and do its very complicated set of deployments and expansions that transform it in, from its packed storage configuration in the rocket into the telescope that we know. And it will, so about 30 days, about half of that to actually do the transformation, and about 30 days total to get into position, which is 1 million miles. So Hubble's only a few hundred miles up. James Webb will be 1 million miles away, following, kind of in an orbit a little bit larger than the Earth around the sun. So once it gets there, it'll be able to operate. Then there's a whole series of tests to make sure the thing actually does, work, and then to make sure that it provides good data. So there's a bunch of engineering tests and calibrations. It has to cool down to the right temperatures. It's made up of 18 individual telescope mirrors, which have to be focused properly. And each instrument in it is going to have its own testing period. So we're going to start seeing engineering data, and none of that will look terribly interesting anyway. And so the first gorgeous pictures in the telescope we anticipate being about 6 months after the launch, which is, if the launch is, let's say, October 31st, then April 30th or May 1st of 2022.
So that'll be fun to look forward to. And then I've got one question on shadows. So you talked about how the shadow in your example was, or you said, could be mistaken for the bat signal. When astronomers look up at star systems, do they always think that these features were shadows, or could they have mistaken them for, I don't know, like a fat man turning himself into a UFO and flying in front of a star system or something?
Understanding that particular thing was a shadow was not obvious. I mean, it was actually, the first time I saw the picture, I didn't think it was a shadow. I thought that there was an absence of material there. And, but there were some clues that couldn't be the case just by looking at it. And the biggest one was that it moved. But it moved. So think about it this: if there was a lack of stuff there, if that was like an arc of vacuum or some lack of thing, then the whole thing wouldn't slide back and forth together, right? I mean, like that would be really strange behavior for the entire cloud to just be sweeping like that. So that tells you right off the bat. But I mean, you don't need 2 images to know that that's a shadow. It's based on the geometry, and it's based on the fact that when we look at things, we don't look at them at just one frequency of light, because if you look at that region in a different wavelength, it looks different. So we can use the relationship to understand whether there really is this cold dust and gas there, or if it's really empty, based on what, because it's not just visible to all wavelengths. So an example of this you might think of in real life is, the stealth bomber or whatever, right? I mean, these things are difficult for radar to detect, but they're there. They're not like a visibility cloak. You can see them. So it's because you're looking in the wrong wavelength of light that you can't see it, but it's not like it's not there. So you can use different pieces of information other than just that one image to tell. And the other thing I should say is that the reason that Hubble was looking there in the first place was because an image had been taken much earlier from the European Southern Observatory, ESO, that was a lower resolution but very gorgeous image and very clearly showed this structure. So we had a hint that was going to be there. As I said, we just didn't know it would move.
Cool. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. Anyone else that's listening in, this is your last chance. Otherwise, I guess we pass it to Matt.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Joel. Again, a reminder to everyone that this presentation, like all of these, being recorded. It will be right here on the Nerd Nite Facebook page, but also go to youtube.com/nerdnite, and it will also live there as well as dozens of other presentations we've had from around the globe. So with that, it's time to head about 2 time zones over from East Coast time right now to our lovely friends in Calgary, Alberta. So Joe, go ahead and take it away, and go ahead and talk a little bit about Nerd Nite Calgary and intro Bryan.
Nah, I'm sorry, but we can't have a space-themed Nerd Nite without bringing in a little Klingon. So greetings from Calgary, where the University of Calgary motto in the original Klingon was, of course, Min Dotwij Vipet Moch, or I lift up mine eyes, usually to the mountains here in beautiful Banff, but I guess to the stars tonight. In Calgary, it's not business as usual, so we're really happy to see all of these international nerd nights online. This is our big source of nerd information. And of course, we love seeing all of these presentations. Tonight, we're going to welcome one of our Calgary Nerd Night alumni, Bryan Versteeg, who did a talk for us in Nerd Night Calgary a little while ago, bringing winter with us, Canadians in space. So it's going to be interesting to see how we go from Canadians in space to the rest of the world in space. Bryan's a conceptual designer and an artist within the space exploration industry, and his focus is on human exploration and settlement and what life might look like when we get out there. His passions in the industry are, the home and aspects of living, but he also works with numerous private space companies on concepts like asteroid mining, orbital refueling, and the ISS replacements or additions, whatever those might look like. And his images and animations have been used widely in scientific publications and documentaries to communicate the potential of life beyond Earth, both from current applications to what the long-term vision might be. So Bryan, very much looking forward to knowing if you were in the industry back in the 60s, would the Enterprise living quarters look completely different, or, but I'll turn it over to Bryan with a Klingon cheer. Iudlij Judge, may your blood scream.
Thank you very much. I'm gonna share my screen. It's not giving me the option to share this screen.
Give me 1 second. Let me start and restart, see if I can get that back to you. All right, give that another shot while you're trying to get that going. I just want to say to Joseph, do we really want our blood to scream? That sounds much more like a threat than a happy proposition.
I mean, if you're a Klingon warrior, your blood's screaming anyway, so.
It's true. I'm going to see if I can get my health insurance to cover that. I guess that's a problem here in the States, so I don't know if that's going to work. Bryan, anything we can help you out there with?
I'm not sure why. It's not giving me the option of screen to share.
Here, try one more thing.
Only give me an option of whiteboard to share.
All right, tried one more thing. Give that another shot. In fact, I'll even try. Still nothing.
It worked before, eh?
Yeah. What we could do, if this would help you some time to poke around, do we want to swap spots with our friends in Tokyo and give you a few minutes to see if we can figure this out on the side while we get Tokyo to go?
Sure. If they're ready, I can hop out and come back in and see if for some reason.
Yeah, that might be good. So, hey, Don, are you Don and Andrew? You guys hanging out there? Not sure if you're following along. Great. All right. Yeah, it might be a permission. All right. So yeah. So all right. So everyone, Nerd Night. We're being nimble as always. Quick change of plans here. So while we're going to go and take a little bit of time to see if we can get Bryan squared away here. So we're going to swap the program around, do a flip-flop for our last hour here. So we're going to go across the Pacific Ocean for all of us here in North America and hand this over to our friends at Nerd Nite Tokyo. So go ahead, Andrew and Don. Go ahead, Andrew.
Thanks, Matt. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Yeah, so Nerd Nite Tokyo. Actually, I think the funny part about this is neither Don or I are currently in Tokyo. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I am in Tokyo.
Oh, you are in Tokyo. Sorry, I thought
Yes.
you were in Saitama. I'm in Yokohama. So just flipping, wasn't quite right. I was literally just sitting down from a bathroom break when this happened. Hey everyone, I'm Andrew. I'm the co-boss of Nerd Nite Tokyo. And then I was working on my next paragraph, so I'm not going to do that one. But you know what? I'd like to introduce you to a speaker with amazing talent, endless charm, and abounding style. Unfortunately, he couldn't be with us tonight, so I'm going to instead introduce Don Warren, human. Aside from being a valued and much loved member of the Nerd Nite Tokyo team, Don is a research scientist with the ITEMS program at RECAN and is also totally human. He earned his PhD at North Carolina State University in 2015 and has worked in theoretical astrophysics ever since. He lives in Tokyo with his wife, his daughter, and their collection of more than 100 board games. He is also very passionate about American food, which probably won't seem as novel to all of you as when we do this talk, if I do this intro in Japan, but he's very passionate about American food like Chex Mix and novelty burritos, which I should add is a completely normal human interest. His talk today is titled Fast Radio Bursts, A Cosmic Mystery. Take it away, Don Warren, human.
Okay, I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Let's hope it goes more smoothly than the last person. Well, looks good to me. Tell me if it doesn't look good to you guys.
All good.
Okay, so thanks for the intro, Andrew. As previously stated, my talk is titled Fast Radio Bursts, A Cosmic Mystery. I am Don Warren at the ITEMS program. I work at RECAN in Japan. You can follow me on Twitter at DC Warren with a 3 if you want. I don't actually use Twitter, so this will do you no good whatsoever, but it's an option if you're bored. And before I continue, I've been asked to do a brief word from our sponsor, my sponsors. Greetings from Japan, where the Nerd Nite Tokyo team has some fabulous swag for all your thinking and drinking needs, whether you like wine, whiskey, or matcha beer. Yes, that is green tea beer in this picture. Our Nerd Nite branded laboratory beaker is the perfect glass. You can buy one at ytg.jp/support, missing a T there, or contact us via Facebook or Twitter. And with that brief sponsor message, let's dive into the world of fast radio bursts. Okay, so you may have heard of fast radio bursts already, in which case, bully for you. This news article showed up in 2018, the first time I gave this talk, with the very provocative headline of telescopes pick up huge number of unexplained signals coming from alien galaxies. And this is, it is very provocative because while technically correct, these are galaxies outside the Milky Way where these unexplained signals are coming from. That's not what most readers of The Independent would think when they see this headline. But I am a professional astrophysicist. It is my job to study space and to be a killjoy, really. So even though these aliens are, or even though these signals are coming from alien galaxies, they're not coming from aliens. So over the next, I don't know how long, 20-ish minutes, I am going to present a mystery to you all who are watching. I am going to solve a mystery, and then I'm going to present another mystery. And since time is limited, I'm going to follow the kilt principle. And that kilt principle is best exemplified by this image here, where many poor decisions were made. But I want you to focus on the kilt for now and ignore all the other things going on. The kilt principle states that the talk should be short enough to keep your attention, short enough to grab your interest, but long enough to make sure all the important bits are covered. So that's my goal. That's my job for the next little bit. And now the actual FRB stuff starts in 2007-ish, when a fast burst of radio waves was found in archival radio data. Astronomers are not great at naming things, so when we discovered a fast burst of radio waves, we decided to call it a fast radio burst. And the shape of this signal suggests the source was outside the Milky Way. And for those of you who like numbers, this is about 1.4 gigahertz, so somewhere between FM radio, somewhere between FM radio and your microwave. And the total length of the burst, this is in milliseconds here, so the total length of the burst was 10, 15 milliseconds. Did not last very long. And so that was the first one in 2007 that was noticed. And once astronomers started paying attention to this, we started seeing more of these things, more bursts that last a few milliseconds. Radio waves from somewhere, but nobody knew what they were or where they were coming from. And this is how things went for the next few years. People just kept collecting these fast radio bursts, and yeah, we'll figure it out eventually. And a little bit later, scientists noticed something. And what they noticed was that these fast radio bursts preferentially occurred at certain hours of the Australian day. And this is not what you expect from a typical astrophysical source. There are stars and galaxies basically every direction you could possibly look. And so you don't really think of things as happening around noon. There's really only one thing outside the Earth that normally happens around noon, and that's the sun's at about the peak in the sky. So the question then becomes, are these fast radio bursts related to the sun somehow? Like, is what we're seeing a solar activity? And the answer turns out to be yes, these signals are related to the sun, sort of. And Joel had mentioned in his talk that the universe is a grand experiment that we are just observing. Opportunities in astronomy to do actual lab experiments are few and far between, but this is one of them. Most of the bursts shown in this plot were caused by microwave ovens, and this is the only experimental astronomy paper I can remember seeing in the literature, identifying the source of peritons at the Parkes Radio Telescope, where Emily Petroff and collaborators opened a microwave door while it was still running. And they noticed that the resultant signal leakage showed up in their telescope. So what would happen is that around lunchtime, a bunch of hungry Australian astronomers would filter into the cafeteria, and they wouldn't wait for the microwave to stop running before they'd open it and grab their food. And over in the telescope, they were detecting these as fast radio bursts. So some of these bursts have a terrestrial origin. The rest, including this original one from 2007, thankfully, are almost surely from outside the galaxy, harking back to these alien galaxies from the intro. And we know this because of their distribution in the sky and the shape of these bursts. So on the topic of distribution, if you could send a camera very, very far from Earth, and you could look at the Milky Way from outside, this is more or less what you'd see edge on. Milky Way is a nice spiral galaxy. It's got a bulge of older stars in the middle and some spiral arms that reach out to the side. The sun's here-ish. But this is not what we see from Earth. From Earth, well, not from Tokyo because too much light pollution, you see this, a band of stars with occasional shadows from interstellar dust. These two things, same object, different perspective. And if you have been drinking, I advise you to hold on to something stable, because I'm about to change the perspective of this. Right, so now the Milky Way is horizontal. So now we're sort of looking towards the center from the sun. And I've done this to make it easier to compare against this plot of the night sky. So astronomers sometimes use galactic coordinates because we're bored. And so the Milky Way is the horizontal equatorial line here. And this may not look like much, but this is a distribution of FRBs across the night sky, and it's consistent with random positioning. Now you can explain this with the fast radio bursts coming from very far away, far outside the galaxy, or from very close to the Earth, within the galaxy. Well, closer to Earth within the galaxy, because if you look at the night sky, you see stars, you see bright stars pretty much everywhere you look. There's no obvious clustering until it's dark enough that you can see the Milky Way itself. So the question then is, are these coming from very, very far away, far outside the galaxy, or are they coming from closer in, within the spiral arm of the Milky Way, maybe even within the solar neighborhood or the solar system? So how do we know that they aren't really, really close, these fast radio bursts? And for that, we need to go back to the shape of these. So this shape says that the highest frequency part of the fast radio burst arrived slightly before the lower frequencies. And this has a particular shape, it's quadratic, and it's because space isn't actually empty. There's not a lot of stuff in space. 1 hydrogen atom per cubic centimeter, less if you go outside the Milky Way, but it's not totally empty. So the shape of this curve tells astronomers how much stuff there is between Earth and wherever these fast radio bursts are coming from. I don't really want to get into pulsars. You can ask in the Q&A if you want, but pulsars are astrophysical objects that let us measure the amount of stuff between them and us in the Milky Way. So here's the sun, here's the Milky Way, and there are these pulsars scattered throughout the galaxy. And if you count the amount of stuff, which is called dispersion measure and uses the amazing unit of parsecs per cubic centimeter. If you look directly along the Milky Way at pulsars, that's this line right here, you see that some pulsars have a lot of stuff between us and them, and some pulsars have fewer. If you start looking away from the galactic disk, you see less and less stuff. You've got 2 dwarf galaxies, satellite galaxies, the Milky Way, the small Magellanic Cloud, the large Magellanic Cloud, they're here. And there's a little bit more stuff between their pulsars and the Milky Way pulsars. This is pretty far off the galactic plane here. So how much stuff is there between us and fast radio bursts? Well, the fast radio bursts are the blue circles in this image. So this is not consistent with the distribution of galactic pulsars, which pretty much tells us certainly that wherever these fast radio bursts are coming from, they're not coming from within the Milky Way. So to summarize what we know about fast radio bursts so far, they are short bursts of radio waves. They are not from the Milky Way, and they are not caused by microwaves. So what does cause fast radio bursts? Before I go into any more on that, I want to describe 2 theorems in science. Redmond's theorem is any competent theoretician can fit any given theory to any given set of observations. Sometime later, Malcolm Longacre came up with a corollary that sometimes the theoretician need not be competent. So with that in mind, here is the list of things people have proposed for what could be causing these fast radio bursts. As of 2018, when I prepared this talk the first time, there were more suggestions than there were fast radio bursts observed. And the suggestions ranged from the relatively mundane magnetars to white dwarf mergers, neutron stars collapsing into black holes, and even more bizarre things like comets falling onto neutron stars. I'm not actually sure what this even means. Higgs portals to pulsar collapse. Extragalactic light sails, hey, there's the alien explanation. The Schwinger instability, which sounds inappropriate, but probably isn't. Yeah, so we got a whole host of things it could be and precious little data to help us decide what it is. And that's the outlook on FRBs as of 2018. So we've got many different astrophysical events that happen more or less daily. Gamma ray bursts, which are a topic for a different talk, happen about 300 times per year. We observe about 5,000 supernovae per year. If you do the math and you figure out how much of the sky we actually look at in radio versus the number of fast radio bursts we observe, the expectation was that we could see about 3,000 fast radio bursts per day if we somehow had perfect all sky coverage, maybe even more than that, maybe upwards of 10,000. So if we could actually start detecting more of these things that were not generated by microwaves, maybe we could start taking all these puzzle pieces that don't seem to have anything in common yet and start putting them into a cohesive picture of what these FRBs are. So that was 2018. Time has passed since then. I know it feels like it's been about 2,000 years since 2018, but it's really only been about 24 months. And science has advanced rapidly. So the first few FRBs were discovered by the Parkes Radio Telescope and the Utmost Radio Telescope. And once this became a thing that people knew to look for, more telescopes started checking their data for these FRBs or being built to detect FRBs. So now we have many more radio telescopes observing the night sky, or I guess daytime sky, radio doesn't care, and looking out for these things. So this was the sky plot of 2017. 2 years later, we've got more of these bursts. Not so many more. But then the big radio surveys started to come online. And so the change, I can't actually show you the full plot because it's preliminary. I'm not even sure I should be showing you this patch. So please don't get mad at me, Chime people. But here's a patch of the sky. And if you want to compare 2019 to 2020, these are radio bursts that have been detected since Chime was active, just in that teeny patch of sky. And you've got to think that the rest of the sky is more or less equally dense. So we got a lot of bursts, a lot of fast radio bursts we're dealing with now. Lots more data, lots more opportunities to figure out what the heck these things are. So what have we learned with all of these fast radio bursts? Well, one of the things we've learned is that most FRBs don't repeat, but some do. We knew that before, actually. This burst right here, detected by the Arecibo telescope in Puerto Rico, was a repeating burst. So we knew that, but now we know more of them repeat. And this is actually really, really important information because it tells us that unlike supernovae, unlike gamma ray bursts, and unlike anything that happens after the phrase, "Hey y'all, watch this," fast radio bursts aren't necessarily catastrophic events. Yes, sometimes, at least sometimes, there's something left over after a fast radio burst that can keep chugging and keep producing more fast radio bursts. So most FRBs don't repeat, some do. And then the natural follow-up is, do all FRBs repeat? The further away a source is, the fainter it is. So is it the case that all FRBs produce a wide variety of signals, and we just detect more of them from sources closer to Earth? Or is it the case that some of these just really, truly only produce the one burst ever? And I don't have an answer for you on that. And really, nobody does, because even the people who study this topic have no idea. This was from an online conference earlier this year, and 63 of the most expert people in the world on this have no idea. So your guess is as good as mine. Flip a coin and decide for yourself whether fast radio bursts, all of them, repeat. The other big update was from April this year. A fast radio burst source was identified within the Milky Way, basically in the neighborhood of a known object, a magnetar. Here, there's that word again. SGR 1935 plus 2154. This is an artist's conception of what a magnetar would look like. In a few words, magnetars are neutron stars. They are former stars as massive as the sun, twice the mass of the sun, in roughly the size of New York City, so 10, 20 miles across. They are so amazingly dense that the electrons and protons have been squished together to form neutrons, and that's just at the surface. You go further in, it's possible the neutrons are squished so close together they dissociate into constituent quarks. And that's the regular neutron stars. The magnetars are even crazier. This is one of the things I actually really like about astronomy and astrophysics is that the numbers get so big they stop making sense. A magnetar is so named because the magnetic field of this neutron star is roughly 1 trillion times stronger than a typical fridge magnet. I have no concept of what 1 trillion times stronger means. I can think of a strong fridge magnet that might be 10 times stronger. You go to a few hundred times stronger, you're now looking at lab grade magnets, MRIs. 1 trillion times is more or less inconceivable to me, but someone who can conceive it described magnetars as basically hernias in space-time, because magnetic fields are so strong they can pop electrons and positrons into existence just from the strength of the magnetic field. So it seems that at least sometimes fast radio bursts are caused by magnetars. So if we go back to these FRB options, magnetars, there we go. Hey, you get a green check mark, Popoff et al., Kulkarni et al., Bibarski, Katz, Penn and O'Connor, because you guessed correctly. Jury's still out on most of the rest of these, but who knows? Maybe we'll get another FRB in the future. So that brings me to the end of the talk with a positive outlook, really, because with as many as 3,000 FRBs detected per day, it really shouldn't take us too much longer to go from disparate puzzle pieces to cohesive picture of FRBs. But one thing I am willing to claim, even at this point, not having all the answers, is that it's not aliens. And with that, I'm out of slides. I'm happy to take any questions you guys have.
Yeah, great job. And Andrew, before you pop in, let me just ask one question. Don, if you could go back to the previous slide with all the submissions or guesses or estimates. Yeah. Let me get the name right. Did Lingham and Loeb, third from the bottom, is that published and readable somewhere? I would love to find more in depth about their extraterrestrial theories.
Yes, this is in the literature somewhere. I don't have
Daily
the link
Mail
offhand. Yeah, I can send it to you after the talk, and then you can put it on Facebook or wherever else as like an addendum for interested people. Yeah,
Great.
I can definitely get you the link to that.
Cool. Oh, Matt disappeared. All right. So someone should tell me if there's somewhere other than the Facebook Live thing that I'm supposed to be looking for questions, because there are no questions there.
That's,
So while
well,
someone
either I explained it so well that nobody has questions, or I did such a bad job that no one can figure out what questions to ask.
I
For the
do
sake
have
of my ego, I choose the former.
Yes, I agree. I am going to ask you a question. Maybe we could kill the screen sharing so people can see your face and
You
verify
sure?
that they're speaking to a human. Yeah, so I have a question. I'm sorry, it's not the kind of question you probably were hoping for, but if you had to choose one term from your talk as the name of a prog rock band, which one would it be? Which term would you choose?
Let's go with the Schwinger instability.
Oh, that's a good one. I had Magnetars. I thought Magnetar was a good one, with their first album being Hernias in Space.
Not a bad choice.
But yeah,
so come on, Facebook, ask questions.
It does look
You
like
got me for another minute before I'm supposed to hand things back over to Calgary.
I was gonna say, I really thought that I thought Hernias in Space kind of jumped the shark. I thought some of their original work before they really published that first album was a little bit stronger.
Hernias in Space Time. I got the name wrong.
Right.
I really think I think Don, that should be your next talk. I think you should do a talk on Magnetar, so you can call it Hernias in Space.
I'm game. You know where to find me.
Well, so Don, yeah, there's another question for you. I want to know just how, so you mentioned towards the end about not being able to conceive of trillion times of more powerful than a kitchen magnet. When you're working with other numbers like that, or other astronomers or physicists who are dealing with, these just gigantic, almost irrational numbers, irrational to, I guess, most humans, how do you avoid from losing your mind and freaking out and going to a psychiatric ward when dealing with figures like that?
Have you ever met an astronomer or an astrophysicist? Most of us.
Good answer.
Most of us are already there anyway. So, what's more fuel on the fire?
I think that's the best way to answer that.
There was actually a question in the Zoom chat from Joel. Is it always light sails? Yeah. So did Avi Loeb suggested extra galactic light sails from alien civilizations? I guess it doesn't have to only be light sails. It could be, contact from another alien civilization. I mean, once you invoke aliens, it's like the explosion principle in symbolic logic. Anything follows. So if you're willing to start with aliens, go crazy. Light sails, radio waves, extragalactic microwave ovens being opened prematurely, whatever floats your boat, or right, lights or sails.
Great. And so everyone watching, warning again to all of you, I think this is the best way to end this presentation, is to note that when doing experiments, don't open a microwave too early. Let that burrito finish. When it says 1 minute, it means 1 minute, not 58 seconds. It's a good life lesson for everyone watching. Yeah. I feel like that's
that was actually my other question, is what were the Australian, because if it was an American one, I would have assumed they were like Hot Pockets.
Right.
But yeah, what's the Australian equivalent of Hot Pockets?
I don't know that Emily Petrov mentioned in her paper what was being cooked.
Oh, come on.
Yeah. Sorry, that appears to have been lost to the sands of time, mists of time.
Oh, this is very frustrating.
we do have a question suddenly. Deborah asks, how did you get into this particular field of astronomy/astrophysics?
How did I get into the field of astrophysics? At age 6, I wanted to be an astronaut, and then I discovered that you needed perfect vision to become an astronaut, and so I had to slightly change my career goals, and this was the closest I could get to space without becoming a billionaire and paying someone to take me there. As for fast radio bursts, that's not what I study on a day-to-day basis. I study gamma ray bursts and cosmic rays and other high energy phenomena. This is just a topic near and dear to my heart because it's such a great story. So the way you get into this is by liking space a lot and going to school studying it and hoping that someone will pay you to keep studying it after school.
Okay, with that, we are going to move along. We're going to go back to the future, or back to the past, to where we almost were 32 minutes ago with Nerd Nite Calgary. We talk a little bit more about what it might be like to have the infrastructure of space if we need it. Imagine playing a Sims game only for our galaxy. So Joseph and Bryan, back to you. Let's try number 2 here.
Wait, I think we got this figured out, right, Bryan?
Yeah, I think we do.
Okay, perfect. So I guess on the heels of the last talk, everyone run, grab whatever you need to out of that microwave. Doesn't matter if it's done or not. Avoid Matt's comments about life lessons. Refresh the beer, and we'll figure out what beer coasters in space might look like. Bryan, I'll turn it over to you with the last comment. Yes, I am monitoring the Facebook feed, so if any of the people watching out there have questions for Bryan at the end, feel free to type them in, and we'll do our best to get them answered. So, Bryan, all yours.
Great, thank you very much. So thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I love talking about space and space exploration and space settlement. I've been an artist and designer my whole life, and I've focused a lot on where people live. I've always been very interested in where people live and why they live certain places, and I like to see certain similarities between accommodations across very diverse geographic instances or cultural. There's cultural similarities, and so by looking at the similarities between these diverse instances, we can kind of extrapolate forward to what it might look like when we leave Earth, and the things that we might take with us. So I'm a conceptual designer. I create these visual images to help show the concepts of the industry and the settlement itself. And so I'm going to use these images to kind of show what I think it could look like and try to explain how we go from living on Earth to having thousands or potentially millions of people living in space. So the next 150 years are going to be covered in about 25 minutes. So I'm obviously going to skip over a whole lot of stuff. So let's just start. So currently there's 3 people living in space in the International Space Station. So they're not there permanently, but right now they are living in space. That can be defined as a community, because a community is a group of people living in the same place or having a particular characteristic in common. So obviously these 3 people are living in the same place. They're all astronauts, so they obviously have something in common. And there's things that affect these 3 people that don't affect any of the other 7.5 billion people on Earth. So it's a very unique situation that certainly gives them a sense of community. But that community isn't like any of the communities that we have here on Earth, the things that we're all used to, the things that we enjoy on a daily basis. So how do we get from 3 people to the type of civilization or society or community that we enjoy right now? So there's a lot of different things that have to happen. And so I'm going to talk about a couple of those things and then get to what it could look like when we get there. So first, one of the major things is launch costs to orbit. Right now, it costs an awful lot to get to space. Getting to space is difficult. It's not very accessible. It is quite expensive. To give you an idea, the space shuttle would lift about 27 tons to low Earth orbit at about 54,000 kilograms, $54,000 per kilogram. So that made it very expensive. None of us have that type of money to lift packages and cargo. Currently, SpaceX can fly a Falcon Heavy about 63.8 tons to low Earth orbit for about $1,400 a kilogram. So that's just a fraction, really, of what the space shuttle was doing. Now, it's not exactly an apples to apples comparison, since the space shuttle is also bringing crew, and it's a crew-rated vessel. Falcon Heavy right now is although SpaceX is starting to bring people, that's really just the cargo price right there. But the cost is coming down. So in the very near future, they're hoping that the things like the Blue Origin and SpaceX Starship can bring about 150 tons to low Earth orbit And potentially, if they're able to reuse all the parts of the rocket, they can bring the price down even more to potentially maybe even $30 a kilogram. That's projected a fair ways out. A lot of things have to happen between now and then, but if we get that far, that really changes the game. So imagine trying to ship a package across the country and it costs, say, $1,000. You're not going to ship a lot of things. So imagine there's some type of innovation that makes it now cost 50 cents to ship that same thing across the country. So now you can ship all kinds of things, and there's entire industries that are now enabled by that shipping rate. So the same way that dropping the cost completely opens up opportunities for all different kinds of industries, that's what happens with space. Accessibility to space drastically increases. So there's all kinds of different industries that would now be available and possible. So as we increase the amount of satellites going into space and different vehicles and cargo, it opens up opportunities for fuel stations, essentially, gas stations in space. So now the satellites in space can refuel. A lot of the lifetime requirements and the end of life for a lot of satellites is basically defined by when it runs out of fuel. So if we can refill them, satellites can keep going. They can spread their lifetime costs over many more years. And as the infrastructure increases, because of the volume of satellites going to space and new vehicles and people going to space, the maintenance platforms also increase. So you have maintenance platforms that now can do servicing of satellites, refurbishment, refueling, recycling, assembling, and they can also be building things like settlements. As the settlements get bigger and bigger, we can start to spin them up. Right now, microgravity is not very good for the human body. So people spending a long time in microgravity, they lose bone density and muscle mass. It's really hard on the physiology of us that we've evolved over a million years on a 1G planet. If we leave that, it really affects the body and all of our systems in very negative ways. So once we can spin that up, we can spend a lot more time. We can build in a modular approach where we can really build and increase the volume. The International Space Station is a pretty cramped quarters. So once we can really start to use inflatables to increase the volume of the area that we're in, it really changes the things that we can do in space. The volume, the volume of satellites that we send into space, this also increases or decreases the cost of components. So whereas previously we'd send maybe a dozen satellites, now we can send hundreds and thousands. And so the components themselves, the development of the components, the cost of the development of the components can be spread over thousands of pieces as opposed to individual single digits. So things like solar panels or thrusters or antennas, we can now build thousands and thousands of them. So the cost of the hardware to ship becomes a lot lower, as well as the cost of getting it into space in the first place. So it means missions to something like a mission to an asteroid, which would have normally cost hundreds of millions of dollars, can now be done for tens of millions or even less, which makes missions to something like an asteroid accessible to smaller governments, but also companies, universities. Space becomes a lot more accessible. Now, asteroids themselves are very interesting because of the resources that they have. A metallic asteroid is can be a gigantic ball of stainless steel, has all the iron, nickel, copper, gold, platinum that we would need to build very large space stations. But some asteroids are basically just gigantic frozen muddy balls with a huge amount of hundreds of millions of tons of water available to us. And so the water is the radiation shielding, can be fuel, life support systems. So all the different materials that we need to build things, we can get from these asteroids. we need to identify what the asteroids have. There's lots of asteroids that come very close to Earth on a regular basis, and we know some of them come by every couple of years, or 5 or 6 or 8 years. And so we know when they come by, we don't really know a lot more about them. We have to really get a lot closer to them to have an understanding of what their makeup is. But once we go and do some prospecting, we have an idea of what it's made of, and then we can kind of project a value on that. What can we do with that type of material? Then we have the option of hopping on this asteroid as it passes Earth, and we can mine it for a couple of years, hop off when it comes back close to Earth with whatever it is that we mined. Or we can get to the asteroid early enough in its orbit, give it a slight nudge, and potentially even capture it in something like a lunar orbit, which means that it's only a day or two away. We can access it fairly quickly and mine it at our leisure. At that point, because it's so close, the ability to mine it with robotics is a lot easier too, because the control time, we can operate the robots on the asteroid in real time from here on Earth, as opposed to having a half hour, an hour delay when the asteroid is on the other side of the sun. Now, we can even produce things right from the asteroid. So we can mine the asteroid, refine the stuff that we're getting from the asteroid, and manufacture components right there from the asteroid. So it could be things like solar panels, or it could be structural members for larger space stations. So the larger space stations, that to me is the really interesting part. With the volume that we can get from space, even if launch costs come down a lot from the Earth, the ability to get resources from space really changes things. So it's like if you're going to build a building out in a very remote area, and you have to bring all the supplies with you. So you got to bring all the lumber and hammer and nails. It's a lot of things to bring with you to this place. But if there's already, say, a lumber yard, or whatever it is you're going, all you need to do is bring your hammer and nails and perhaps a buddy and sandwiches and lunch and whatnot, and then you can build, because the lumber is already there. So if we can get the metals for the structures already there, then it means the things that we can bring out from Earth, it can be a lot more specialized. And so more the equipment used to assemble, as opposed to the resources and volume of structural members that we need to assemble. So something like this could be a settlement that's about 500 meters in diameter, about 250 meters long. This would rotate about 2 revolutions per minute. If you're standing on the inside, it would actually feel like 1G, like Earth type gravity on the inside. So then we start to have this volume. Now the volume is important. When I like to talk to people about space settlements, and I'll often just say, I mean, would you see yourself living in space? And if they say no, I pry a little further. Well, like, why not? And one of the things that I get a lot back is people saying they don't like the cramped quarters, and they're maybe claustrophobic. And so if you address those issues, if we can build something that isn't so small, then does that change it? And so you look at the things that they suggest they couldn't live without, and could we bring those things with us? So if we take this, a cross section of this, we've got farming levels and recreation levels and housing levels. So we'd have to be able to grow our own food on site. So we don't want to be bringing food up from Earth all the time. That just doesn't make any sense. If people are going to be living there long term, we want to be able to have a very diverse menu. We want to be able to grow all of the fruits and vegetables and proteins that we would need for people to live. We could have these orchards and all kinds of different fruits. And I mean, you could basically pick what you want to grow, because we can customize the compartments for the growing areas to very specific atmospheric conditions. So we can adjust the pressure with them, the atmospheric pressure, humidity levels, so that they're primed for very specific types of growing and for types of fruits and vegetables. But it means that we can create environments that are very unique and mimic certain environments here on Earth. You could conceivably have entire decks that are unique ecosystems that could be endangered here on Earth. And so we look at this almost as like an offsite storage of biodiversity, where we can maintain this biodiversity off-site, essentially. It's like an ark of flora and fauna. But what about where we live? And this is the part that's really interesting to me. The open spaces, as we get bigger, there's the possibility to get these larger open spaces. So something like this, you're on the inside, think of it as the inside of a massive tuna can, that if you were to walk around the entire circumference of it, it'd be about 1.5 kilometers in your walk. So you're never really that far from anything at one point. And in a way, it kind of has the feeling of you're living in a valley. So lots of people around the world live very happy lives in valleys. So that's kind of what this is. You're kind of living in a valley. And I've always assumed that we would pack these things as much as possible with forests. And the recreational areas, and we don't want to have it, obviously you don't want it to be too crowded. You want a kind of a density that's similar to maybe some small towns, but you want to have the parks, you want to have the recreational areas. The plants operate as quite a few different things. So it's not just a biological life support system. It's it's giving you your food. It's purifying your air. It's giving you oxygen. It can filter water, but it's also for mental well-being. There's lots of studies that show that people are happier when they spend time in nature. It helps their immune system, helps their blood pressure, and just their mental stability. So we have these parks, and we're going to use them. So when we design these places, we can really think about what is it that you like to do here on Earth, and how could we design a place that we could bring that with us. So do you like fishing? Do you want to go to the beach? Do you like walks in the park? Do you like hiking? Do you like having friends over in your back patio for a barbecue? And what else would you do? So the options are very similar to the things that we have here on Earth. When you look at if you're moving from town to town and you want to pick a place to go to, you might think of if you're a golfer, you look for a place that has a golf course. If you're a skier, you look for a place with a ski hill. Because we have the opportunity to really affect the atmosphere and the environment by the atmospheric pressure and the ambient light levels and temperature, it means we can even, if we choose to, create very specific biomes. So you could have a couple of different settlements that have different biomes. Now, there's certainly a lot of reason why you would have something like a tropical or a very temperate type biome. I mean, people like warm weather, and I totally get that. But I'm Canadian, and I've grown up my entire life around boreal forests, and so I've always thought, what if we bring a boreal forest with us? So that would mean a couple things. Boreal forests require seasons in order to go through their whole growth stages. So that means winter. What if we went ahead and had winter? So I'm not saying all of winter. There's a lot of things about winter I don't like. Winter here could be up to 8 months, which I think is absolute bullshit. No one should have to live through 8 months of winter. But if we can schedule it, and we could, then what if we do? And I just, this is a thought experiment. I'm saying we could do anything. If we're trying to explore what this place could be, let's just explore it. Let's think, what could we do? And as we get closer to it, we'll figure out what it is we're actually going to do. So let's imagine we have a winter. Instead of 8 months, let's have a 2-month winter, maybe December, January. You have 2 months of spring, 2 months of fall, 6 months of summer, and we'll take just the parts of winter that we really like. In my own backyard, I have lights in the trees, and it's really nice when the snow's on the trees and there's frost all over, and the lights just create an ambient glow that's just, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful time of year. You don't want it to last that long, and you don't like the -30 It doesn't need to be minus 30. You could set a range of -5 to -10 or -15. And so just cold enough to help the plants recycle and recharge and reset their clocks so that they can start their spring again. A lot of seeds require that cold period before they can germinate in the spring. So I focus not just on how living on space would be different, but how it could be the same. So I walk my dogs every single day, rain or shine, +30 or -30. These are my dogs and my wife. I would want to bring my pets with me. So one thing that would be similar if I was in these space stations is I would walk my dogs. And I think it's interesting to imagine these places as in all the different ways that they're similar to and have all the luxuries of the home that we have right now, but it's literally, it could be thousands, could be hundreds, could be millions of miles away from where we are currently. If you don't like the winter, it's not going to last that long. And then you get back into spring and the beautiful leaves and colors and blossoms and the trees and all the things that come with spring. If you like the seasons, then this might be, if you don't like the seasons and you just like warmth, well, that's fine too. Because if we have the infrastructure to build one of these, we probably have the infrastructure to build dozens or hundreds of them. So you could literally choose the structure that has the environment that you're looking for. Or you could even hop around to different ones. You could go skiing in one and fishing in another, or just hiking, or vacation ones, or some that are set up just like Vegas. So I'll leave you with this. Space settlement can be whatever it is we make it. It's far enough away, we get to decide. So if there's something that you like currently in your life, in your home, imagine how we could bring that with us. Because a lot of these things really can be brought with us. So that's about it. If you hold your camera phone up to the screen, this QR code will take you to a YouTube video. It's a virtual file of the inside of one of those habitats. So you can kind of do a zoom around and check it all out.
So Bryan, of the various habitats, what would be the top two that you would choose?
The designs of habitats, there's the Bernal Sphere, the O'Neill Cylinder. There's a lot of different designs of habitats. I like, it's one called the Kalpana 1, which is what I've shown in these views is it's kind of like an elongated tuna can, just because of the amount of habitable space you can have per shielding and structural mass. It's a very efficient shape. It also it spins without a lot of extra correction. Things like the O'Neill cylinder would tend to want to wobble, and they would need a lot of correction to prevent the wobbling. Obviously, the wobbling inside would be horrific for anyone involved. So without a lot of correction, you get a lot of habitable volume per shielding and structural mass. And I mean, I like the idea of seasons. Although if I didn't have winter, I could live without winter. I mean, I could.
I don't know, I like your thinking. I really like the idea of like a 2-month winter and then even seasons after that. Have it, enjoy it, and then get rid of it. All right, Joseph, over to you.
I see a few questions coming in on Facebook, but I have to ask my own question first. A lot of us that, get into some very narrow scope of something for a living, then go and watch movies and go, that's not how it works. But you got a really cool insight because you're also communicating sort of what you think this might be to make it believable and to sell it to an audience. So when you watch like Elysium with Matt Damon or Armageddon with Bruce Willis, are you like going, oh my God, they got that so incredibly wrong? Or do you like what you're seeing in science fiction?
I really enjoy. I love science fiction. I watch a lot of it. I probably watched The Martian 20 times. But Elysium, the biggest thing that I had problem with Elysium is that there was one gigantic space station that was, I don't even know what the diameter was, but it was probably hundreds of miles. And it was the only space station. If you have the infrastructure to build that, it's kind of like saying the only boat on the seas is a gigantic Carnival Cruise Lines. For every one Carnival Cruise Lines, there's hundreds of smaller fishing boats, and for every one of those, there's even hundreds of smaller fishing boats, and for each one of those, there's little trawlers, and so to think that there's only one gigantic space station, they just went straight to the infrastructure to build that. So if there's one of those stations called Elysium, there's probably thousands of space stations that are a quarter the size or a tenth the size. And if that thing is millions of people, that means there's thousands of stations that are for thousands of people and hundreds of people. And that's the biggest thing ahead. It's like there was Earth and then there's Elysium. I can't wrap my head around that even being a possibility.
Awesome. Andrew typed into the Facebook comments there, maybe this is out of the scope for this talk, but what keeps these things rotating? So you're talking about the amount of rotation and very little correction. So if a solar flare, for example, knocks the power out for several hours or longer, how long before that lake of water is just floating in the air?
Okay, so in a vacuum, they're rotating. There's no friction to really stop them. Once they're moving, you actually have to apply force to stop them from moving. So it requires a lot of energy to spin them up. But once they're spin up, it would take a lot of energy to stop them. And so if you stop applying energy, it just keeps spinning. It's a top without any friction to stop it. And so it would take a lot of, you would almost have to, if it's spinning like this, you would have to fire off a lot of mass in the opposite direction to try to slow it down, but you'd have to fire off an immense amount of mass. So stopping it from spinning is actually a very difficult process.
Cool. And my co-boss here in Calgary wants to know, what do you think is a reasonable timeline for any settlements being created in this way, and what kind of sizes do you think we would start with?
So I think what we would do in the near term, there's some intermediary things we have to do. We have to take something that could be 100 meters in diameter, and it's really just a pod on each end, and spin it up, because we don't have a lot of experience in spinning up large structures and using artificial. That would be artificial gravity at that point, and it's just centripetal force. And so we would have to do some intermediary smaller things that are like that first. And those things, I mean, they could be done, we could be working on those today. We're not, but we could be. So I think as the Starship, the SpaceX Starship gets online, I think the ability for it to carry payloads into space that are larger, a lot more usable, with something like maybe 3 payloads, we could have a fairly large space station that would have centripetal force and have probably 2 or 3 times the interior volume than the International Space Station has now. So that's something that could happen. I mean, it could be 5 years from now. It could be fully functional in 5 years from now. But that would require us to, I mean, kind of start now. In all likelihood, there's before that there's smaller inflatable segments that are for maybe a dozen people or so, and they can be a private, not gravity, so they're just floating, and just maybe a couple dozen people. I think we could get to hundreds of people, settlements for hundreds of people, within decades. But there's things we have to do between then. Before that is the asteroid mining, and that's something we could be doing 5 years ago easily. Obviously we're not, but we are doing missions. The Japanese Space Agency did a mission to Hayabusa. This year they're doing a sample return from an asteroid. So little steps like that prove the technology to be able to carry out these prospecting return missions to identify the targets. And once we start mining the resources available, that changes the game. But it's when we start. From the time we start, it's 5 years out or 10 years out or whatever. So it's it could start happening right now, but it's not.
Well, we got one more question just came in on Facebook here. what would be the major risks to stability, durability, and life, of course?
So there's risks of radiations. You'd have to have a fair bit of shielding if the structure is outside of the Van Allen belt, which is around Earth. It's kind of a magnetic shield that protects Earth and its atmosphere from bombardment of radiation. So if it's outside of there, we're going to need a lot more radiation shielding. So radiation is going to be one of the main things. Micrometeorites is also an issue, but the shielding helps protect us from the micrometeorites as well. Large meteorites is something that we should be able to move away from. But I mean, there are things that we can protect, we can prepare for.
Matt, do we have time for one more question from Don in the Zoom chat there?
Yeah, go for one more. Big finish.
All right, so yeah, the big question is, I'm picturing that meme of Futurama with Fry going, "I don't want to live on this planet anymore." And Don asks, how has the coronavirus situation changed how willing people are to live in space? And have you done any polls on this since, say, March?
No, I have not done anything recently. I think something like coronavirus, if this place is isolated, then even just the duration of people going from, depending on how isolated it is, just the duration of people going from Earth to this structure would be more than 14 days. So potentially something like this could be very well insulated from the coronavirus. And so you'd have people operating like life as usual completely. But it is confined quarters. So potentially, if something does get there, it could be a different type of pandemic. But as long as you still have the same options for social distancing and and it's not too dense, it certainly creates an argument against a very dense settlement. So as long as you still have space, and space is always what I try to design for. Space is very important as here and there. For just quality of life and safety.
Awesome.
Great. All right. So can I have all of our presenters and all of our Nerd Nite bosses who are still hanging out turn on your webcams for a second? I want to thank everyone, not only for tonight, but for all the presenters from the 12 other cities who presented over this series since we started at the beginning of the month. It's kind of cool that we did this across 3 different continents and 5 different countries and 7 or 8 different states here in the States. It's nice that we get to at least have a wider breadth of things virtually, even though we can't do things face to face. The plug, if you everything you're seeing on your screen right now is, of course, the Nerd Nite YouTube page. So if you've not done so already, go ahead and subscribe to that at some point. It's just youtube.com/nerdnite. It's a combination. There are probably about 50 or 60 videos up there now. The majority of them were captured live at various face-to-face events throughout the world over the last couple of years, but we've also put a few virtual ones up there as well, since that's what we've had to do the last few months. But again, this has been a fun series. We've covered everything there is to cover in space. That's it. There will never be another space presentation in the history of Nerd Nite ever, because you saw it all in the last 4 weeks here. That's probably not true. Well, maybe when the Webb telescope goes up in 57 weeks, we'll talk about that. Joel, no pressure onto you. So everyone, thanks so much. Brian, Don, Joel, Chris, all the presenters who were here on the September 6th and September 13th and September 20th. Thank you to everyone as well. I guess that's it. So hopefully we will see a lot of you at a face-to-face Nerd Nite sometime soon, somewhere in the world. If not, we will have a number of other virtual ones coming up before the year wraps up as well. So thanks, everyone. Bye, everyone. Thanks, everyone. And we'll see you when we see you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.